Welcome to Lunch With, our monthly webinar series where we have an informal conversation over a virtual sandwich with interesting and significant people within the broadly within the justice sector. Today I'm delighted we're having a double header. We're having lunch with Pragna Patel from Southall Black Sisters and Suresh Grover from the Monitoring Group. Both extraordinary organisations who for many, many years now have been at the heart of pressing for Black liberation and race equality and racial justice. And I'm really delighted that both Pragna and Suresh have agreed to have lunch with us today to talk about the work of their organisations over the years and the current and future challenges. So we're going to be using, as those who are familiar with the Zoom webinar format, we're going to be using the Q&A function. So if you have a question that you would like Suresh or Pragna, or indeed both of them, to consider and address, then do get your questions in on the Q&A. And broadly speaking, we're going to be covering four broad areas. We're going to start with just talking a little bit about where the Monitoring Group and Southall Black Sisters came from, as it were, how they were set up, what problem, as it were, they were seeking to address. We're going to talk a bit about the key struggles that those organisations have been engaged with over the years. We're going to do a bit of an assessment of the current situation, and then we're going to look to the future and future challenges. And what I'd like to do is try to keep the conversation moving. So if you do want to ask a question about where, for example, Southall Black Sisters came from as an organisation, what the thinking was behind it and why it was important to set it up, then ask your question early. Don't wait until the last 5 minutes, because we won't be able to come back to your question then, and I'm afraid we need to kind of keep the things moving on. So I'd now like to invite Suresh and Pragna to join us, and we'll make a quick start. So Suresh, Pragna, thank you so much for agreeing to join us today for this discussion. First of all, let's turn to the origins of your organisations, and perhaps Suresh, if I could start with you and the origins of the Monitoring Group. Just tell us a little bit about where the Monitoring Group came from as an organisation and as a project, and indeed as a movement. Why it was set up and what problems it was seeking to address.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your lunch. Never done a Zoom meeting in lunch, but this is a rare occasion, and I'm really privileged to be here. Our origins are really from local and national events to do with race, locally in Southall, and then the anti-racist rebellion struggles that took place from 1970s to 1981. I don't have an exact date to tell you when we were set up, but I can tell you that very safely, by the end of 81, 40 years ago, having worked in Southall since 1976 onwards, or 75 onwards, in fact, there are a number of driving factors that forced us to come together to establish an organization, and we were a group of local activists and lawyers. Before that, we were an ad hoc group responding to incidents of police brutality and street racism, and working on housing estates that were labeled as, for example, sink estates. Very, very quickly, because I don't want to take a long time on this, I suppose the critical factors were really three, I think, decisive ones. The first is the sequence of events that shape Southall politics of a younger generation that starts with the murder of Gurdeep Singh Chaggar in June 1976, and also the murder of Blair Peach in 1979 by the Special Patrol Group. I'm not going to go through the detail of it. If people want to ask me the detail, I'll very willingly answer them, because I was there at the time and I remember them clearly. But the 76 events is really the growth of male-dominated youth movements that sprung up as a reaction to police and street violence. and then became a national phenomenon throughout Asian communities. The murder itself was contested by the police, whether it was racially motivated or not. And at that period, the family weren't even allowed in the well of the court because of the manner in which the criminal justice system operated against Black Asian people at that time. And, the killing of Blair Peach is very well known nationally. A school teacher at a demonstration against the National Front on 23rd of April, 1979. He's not doing anything, but we have an orgy of police violence against 5 to 10,000 people who'd congregated against the National Front, who were promoting repatriation of anybody who was not white, I suppose. And that orgy of violence led to over 800 arrests within a period of 7 hours, 345 people charged with criminal offenses, 100 of injuries to people, and the killing of Blair Peach by a special patrol group officers. It's been a case that's lasted a long time. And last year, on the 40th anniversary, or 2 years ago, we actually put a plaque in his memory outside the town hall. Blair Peach's case is really about 3 things. The first is the act of solidarity, which is being criminalized by the state forces because his crime is simply to be at the demonstration against racists. The second is the militarization of the police force. With the advent of the events taking place in northern of Ireland and policing practices coming to so-called mainland. And then you have a campaign of accountability by the family. Unfinished business, in fact, because the way the inquest dealt with the case, the jury were told not to come out, about to restrict their verdicts. They weren't allowed to come with a verdict of unlawful killing. They were given restrictions on what they could come out with, so they decided on death by misadventure. And the coroner, Sir John Burton, I remember him very clearly. I mean, out of no evidence whatsoever, despite the fact that, SPG lockers had been searched. By the way, Richard, you must stop me. I don't want to take Pragna's time because once I start, I don't know when to finish, so just tell me, or Pragna, you.
Yeah, we will need to move on.
And these events are kind of living memory for me. So I know, and Pragna knows me, so I won't think you are rude if you interrupt me. So I'll just finish with a number of things very quickly. I won't take more than 2 minutes. The coroner, despite the overwhelming evidence of unlawful tools they had, truncheons with lead cautious, which killed Blair Peach, the coroner came out with this theory that he must have been killed by a left-wing activist to make him a martyr, And then, it's just a ridiculous stuff, but it's an inquest which challenged the operations of the coroner's court and allowed juries for the first time to be involved. So, but it's, as I said, unfinished business, and we constantly meet Celia Stubbs, actually represented by Butt Murphy. So, etc. And I think the other factor that's very decisive is the 81 rebellions. And I don't want to break down to it, but I'll just list the flashpoints. The first is
let's move on to those, because I do want to talk a little bit about some of the key moments in the work of your and Pragna's organization. So hold the thought on 1981 and since. But let's bring in Pragna. Suresh just talked about some key moments, indeed some kind of quite foundational moments, which motivated the establishment of the monitoring group. I'm just wondering, was that the case also with Southall Black Sisters? And I'd also be really interested in your thoughts on the fact that Southall Black Sisters, Suresh was talking about some quite sort of male-dominated anti-racist movements, and that was distinctive. And also, without being facetious about it, the reference to Southall Black Sisters. So. Some thoughts on
yes, that? So Suresh, well, thank you very much, Richard. It's a real honor to be here and actually talking to my friend and comrade for many years, Suresh. I think that what Suresh has highlighted, he's described a very foundational moment for the monitoring group. It was the same foundational moment for Southall Black Sisters. I mean, we began our political life under Thatcherism and the politics of Thatcherism, you know, decimation of communities, deprivation that was unprecedented, fragmentation of community life and so on, and rampant capitalism. I mean, that is the economic landscape that we kind of were born into. And we were also at the same time a child of the resurgent second wave feminism. The feminist movement, you know, sort of sprung back into action around a series of demands, rights to abortion, rights for shelters for battered women, equal pay, and so on. And we were also a child of the burgeoning anti-racist movement that Suresh is talking about. So, you know, in the 70s, women from a number of backgrounds, South Asian, African, Caribbean, Middle Eastern, etc., were very much part of the anti-racist mobilizations in Southall, and were very much involved in the defense of Southall against, you know, racial and fascist provocation and violence and institutional violence from the police and so on. But the same movement felt that, the same group of women who began Southall Black Sisters also felt the need to challenge the very movement that they were born into, for the silences around women, the silences around gender, and the sexism of those movements, you know. And that's what Suresh talks about when he says, you know, the very male-dominated character of anti-racist movements. And very much those same women felt that as Black women, I'll come back to the issue about Black, but as Black women, their lives are shaped not just by racism and by their socioeconomic positions, the class positions, but also by their sex, you know, the very sex and the sex discrimination that they experienced within the movements, but also in the wider society. So Southall Black Sisters very much is a dissenting child, if you like. It was both drawing on the traditions of anti-racism, of the feminist movement, of other social justice movements, as well as challenging them around issues of sexism and so on, sex discrimination. So why Southall Black Sisters? Southall is self-evident, you know, that was where the group of women that came together were located, and very much involved in the struggles for social justice in those communities. Black because the women that came together had a political perspective that we shared with wider activists in the community like Suresh and others, that was very much borrowed from the civil rights movement of the US and the Black Power movements of the US, that had used the term Black in a political sense. So Black signified not the color of one's skin, but actually signified common histories of colonialism and imperialism and the struggles against both, and struggles for independence, in fact, globally. And so the idea of Black was always a contested term. Not all Asians, for example, accepted the term, but within anti-racist circles, it was more or less accepted as a kind of unifying political term, you know, sort of stressing the commonalities of experiences of racism rather than the differences amongst us. And I think that was a really progressive moment. It was a hugely progressive moment, because Black didn't just signify aspirations towards solidarity and unity, but it was also secular. And I think that was no accident. You know, these were really terms invested with a very secular, progressive politics. And sisters, mainly because of that kind of feminist identity of Southall Black Sisters. That's why you have Southall Black Sisters. It actually signified a politics that was simultaneously anti-racist, feminist, progressive, secular, and anti-fundamentalist at the same time. So early Southall Black Sisters were involved on the one hand around campaigns, you know, challenging racism, whether it was in schools or the police or the courts or the criminal justice system. At the same time, they were involved in challenging patriarchal norms within the community that generated silence around domestic abuse, gender-related violence, forced marriage, and so on. And so they challenged. So in a way, Southall Black Sisters came out of, and the politics that I inherited when I came on the scene in 1982 was very much a secular, anti-fundamentalist, anti-racist, feminist politics, which I want to hold on to dearly in these incredibly challenging times where identity politics is raging all around us. So that's, you know, some sort of, if you like, an account, a little bit of the origins of Southall Black Sisters. I came on the scene in 1982 at a time when the original founders left. And so I refounded the organization, but also then founded the advocacy center that's still going now, and the campaigning center that's still going now. So that's, you know, in a nutshell, the history.
And what is the sort of, what do you see as the main focus of your activities at the moment?
Yes. So
and then Suresh will ask you the same question. The
main focus of our activities is to address the multiple needs of Black and minority women who come to our doors desperate for support and help in the wake of domestic abuse and gender-related violence and associated issues such as destitution, homelessness, immigration insecurity, racism in terms of statutory responses, and so on. When we set up the Advocacy Center in 1983, with a grant from the then GLC, we had no idea. We wanted to set up an advocacy center modeled slightly on law center kind of framework. We had no idea what women were going to come to us with, but very quickly, the majority of the women who arrived at our doors wanted support around issues of violence in their families, violence in their relationships and marriage. So that has been the dominant issue that women have presented with, and has continued to be the dominant issue. And so our frontline services provide practical support to women, facilitate their access to the legal systems to obtain justice in the face of violence, you know, that they faced and abuse that they faced, and then actually deal with all the related issues of racism, of immigration controls, of destitution and homelessness, and so on. So in a way, in meeting those needs, we are forced to tackle the immense internal and external barriers that women face in asserting their human rights, their right to life, their right to be free from inhuman and degrading treatment, their right to choice in marriage, their right to you know, have independent careers, their right not to be discriminated, and so on and so forth. So our aim is to advocate on women's behalves, both at an individual level, but also at a political level, and to ensure that Black and minority women are visible and have a voice in political struggles, in policy circles, and to, on a much more wider scale, to ensure that we develop political movements and politics that try to bridge the gaps between race, gender, class, and so
on. Thank you very much, Pragna. So Suresh, I mean, the work of the monitoring group, I mean, you also do advocacy representation, but I think my sense is it's a kind of a slightly different focus to Southall Black Sisters. Would that be?
I'm not, we see ourselves as a community, it's not one community, but communities-led anti-racist organization. We believe we have a very unique hybrid model of fusing frontline services such as advocacy and trauma. support with strategic thinking and campaigning. Sometimes it's national to international campaigning. We also initiate needs-based projects and campaigns to growth of racism, to newer emerging communities, as well as the alarming growth of what we say is religiously inspired communalism in the South Asian diaspora. We use many tools to paint a social landscape of racism in this country, from casework to the arts. And over the last 5 years or so, due to the combination of austerity, Brexit, and COVID, our work has evolved on not just responding to frontline services, but saving public services and utilities like town halls, which we see as secular places, as well as responding to critical spikes in racism or race incidents, and organizing, especially over the COVID period, with like-minded individuals and organizations in Southall, a network delivering food parcels to over 700 families in Ealing and Southall. So it's evolved based on what the needs are. My recollection, Pragna, and it's really important that you've raised this of secular ideas, very, very important. My recollection, and I want to agree with you, but I want to get my mind head over this clearly, because you may be able to help, because we met in 1982. There were always battles to do with secularism in areas like Southall, as you've said. But the younger generation actually didn't use the word secular until 1982, 84. And so in the formation of the early Southall Black Sisters, people like, I mean, you know them and I know them, secularism wasn't used as a term, but communal violence was, which I know leads to the same project. But the younger generation didn't use secular really until, in South Asian communities, until the Operation Blue Star and the emergent Khalistani movement in 1984. Just want to get a historical perspective because it's such a key area in development, etc. Richard, I just want to expand on just one thing before. I think I've succinctly pointed out what we do. That hybrid model is important, but the 81 period, just in terms of flashpoints, the entire history is very important. It actually doesn't just mean looking at the American situation and the civil rights movement, which is very key and important, as Pragna has already outlined. But one of our foremost kind of influences was the Irish situation and the hunger strikes, which had evolved for 5 years, and in 1981 culminated in the death of the hunger strikers and Bobby Sands and people. That was a heart-wrenching moment for us. It's not that we supported the Republican movement unquestionably, etc., but we saw Irish racism for what it was, based on colonialism and the militarization and the occupation of the nationalist communities. And the lessons we learned from that was the resilience and the resistance and fusing advice with political work in area like the Divis flats, etc. And then in January, you had the New Cross massacre, where 14 children died, which culminated in, I think, one of the largest ever Black Days of Action. I think 20,000 people. I remember going to the march in March 1981. And then you have these rebellions in 30 cities. I think very soon after that, Pragna, I met. Pragna, I think you're wrong. You didn't meet me in 82. You didn't come. You came in 81.
Yeah, all right.
July, August 1981. I'm really sorry, but my memory is slightly better than yours because I actually remember exactly when I met you. It was on the 14th or 15th of July, 4 days after. Maybe you had come from university for a holiday.
I had.
And it had just after the 10th of July uprising in Southall, a week after we had burnt Havro Tavern because of the skinheads coming in, and you came to Southall, right? And we met, I think, 14th, 15th of July. So, I mean, you came a year earlier than you're saying. You
Okay.
This, Richard, it shows we haven't talked to each other for some time, although we are in the same damn town. But I just want to say this, what are the key lessons? The lessons are about this. We don't believe in providing social services type kind of service. Yes, we provide support, but we want to empower individuals and our clients. We don't think they are selfless or people who can't think and they are there to be sacrificed and we are the experts. We think that with partnership, because they come from our communities and we have ourselves suffered racial violence, we can have a relationship where we discuss, use law as a tool to actually hold the state to account, whether it's domestic violence, policing, or whatever it is, and improve the lives of the affected communities. I think one of the crucial things for me in terms of the drivers was very personal. I had given up on England in 1978. I'd had enough of the Southall youth movement. Everybody knows that. It was, I mean, when I say it was male-driven, absolutely right, it's patriarchal. But I was attracted to it because it actually, you know, I was stabbed by skinheads in Nelson, Lancashire. I was actually full of fear. It paralyzed me. And I had to overcome that fear. Southall is where I overcome the fear by standing next to people on the streets, facing skinheads, and I knew people wouldn't run away. It gave me that strength. It's how do we stop people handcuffing us or beating us? We link arms. You know, that's actually a very simple act. And what I think the original Southall Blacks wanted to do was link arms with the Southall youth movement, but these guys never ever wanted to link arms because they saw them as a threat, because they were women and asking serious questions. So I'd given up and I thought, you know, I'm going to go to India and make a positive impact. And it showed me going to India for, I mean, I only lasted 11 months to my, you know, kind of shame, but truthfully, I met people who'd gone through the emergency and authoritarianism of Indira Gandhi, which has become even more absurd and glaring under Modi. But I lived and worked with people who lived in slums. And it showed me that in the West, we are very, very fortunate in how we live. And therefore, our staying power has to be much more greater. We don't have to keep on asking why we struggle, because that's what the third world activists don't have the luxury to ask. It's right in the front, in their faces. And I was defeated not by state violence in India, but my health suffering because I couldn't stay in slums and things like that. And it rekindled in the Southall monitoring group, and then later on, us working together and setting up and establishing, for example, a VAR South Asia Watch, communal politics and the impact of religion as a permanent feature of, you know, both the organizations. I think that's a very personal driven thing, but it became an organizational kind of outcome.
I mean, I agree with you in the sense that, you know, I think the interesting thing about the 80s and the 70s and 80s, when our organizations developed, our politics, we mobilized around our political values and things, is the fact that we didn't have to state we were secular. We were. It was like taken for granted that we were secular. So, you know, you didn't need to put it in your constitution. You know, it was so taken for granted. What else were we to do? I mean, you know, as a community, Southall has a long tradition of activists who were active in trade union movements and in you know, progressive movements in India and elsewhere, who brought those politics with them in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you know, and that is also a tradition that is our tradition in terms of borrowing from that and building on that. And they were secularists. They were secularists. And in many ways, I have always seen my political struggle as a struggle in defense of secular values. More recently, I think actually since the Rushdie affair was such a turning point for many of us, and certainly for because it was the first time we thought about making that explicit, the need to defend secular values, the need to actually defend a progressive politics from the encroachment of fundamentalist religion in communities, in diasporas and communities, particularly South Asian in this country. And, you know, when the Rushdie affair happened, when the fatwa was issued, and we decided, we were absolutely traumatized by what we were witnessing. And it seemed to us that the only people who were coming out in defense of Rushdie were the literary establishment, were those in the literary establishment who framed the defense in terms of freedom of speech. Now, freedom of speech is an important value. I mean, it's a whole debate in itself in terms of discussions as to the boundaries and limits of it. But it is an important foundational value, you know, for those of us who want to see democracy and democratic values flourish. But it wasn't just for us as feminists in Southall Black Sisters, it wasn't just about freedom of speech, because we understood that what was happening was not some mad Ayatollah who was acting on his own in issuing the fatwa, but an organized political movement based on regressive religious values that wasn't going to stop at attacking Rushdie, but was going to, that was just the starting, that was the, you know, the first warning shot, that fundamentalism represented more than just a threat to writers and to artists. It represented a threat to feminists, to trade unionists, to progressive, you know, activists, because it's about silencing dissent. And we understood that feminism is also in the business of dissenting. We dissent against patriarchal orthodoxies. We dissent against, you know, sort of male-dominated values and so on and so forth. So for us, that was the bridging thing, that it was about understanding that defending Rushdie was also defending our secular traditions and our progressive politics. And actually the situation has got worse since then. We have seen the rise and rise and rise of the religious right in all the religions, as well as the far right. And both present huge challenges to us, I think, today. And with it, the rise of what I consider to be identity politics of the worst kind. But, you know, the Rushdie affair was a major turning point. We set up, as a result of what we were fearing would happen and has come to pass, we set up Women Against Fundamentalism. And that involved women from all backgrounds challenging fundamentalism in all religions, campaigning around the rise of fundamentalism in all religions, not just in the UK, but globally. We had seen what was happening to women in Ireland, to the US, women in the US with the rise of, you know, Reagan and so on, and the politics of the Tea Party and the conservatives there, the rise of Hindu nationalism and fundamentalism in India, the rise of Islamism in Pakistan, and so on. And so for us, there was some real commonalities of, you know, of that kind of politics that we were seeing globally. And we decided to demonstrate against the fanatics, and they were in their thousands, in you know, outside the Houses of Parliament, Parliament Square, calling for death to Rushdie. And it was quite frightening to see thousands of predominantly young men who would have been second generation, and boys, second generation South Asian, who would have grown up in the kind of political struggles, would have witnessed the political struggles that Suresh has talked about in Bradford and elsewhere, you know, against racism, calling for the death of Rushdie and supporting this kind of regressive politics. And we were about 40 women. And what was interesting about what is now quite an iconic moment of Women Against Fundamentalism and Southall Black Sisters is that on the one hand, we were shouting down with fundamentalism, and there was a group of fascists who'd also turned up, hoping to challenge the Muslims, the mainly Muslim demonstrations of men, but who felt that it was too big and decided to turn their anger against us. And so, making Hitler salutes and shouting verbal abuse at us, racist verbal abuse. So 1 minute we're shouting down with fundamentalism, and the next minute we're shouting down with fascism and down with racism. And in a way, that moment encapsulates what our politics and our political journey has been about over the years, which is facing simultaneously the forces of regression, at one and the same time, and that no one politics is to be prioritized over another. If fighting fascism is important, so is fighting for patriarchy, so is fighting fundamentalism, and so is fighting, class deprivation, and so on. And the challenge is precisely that. How do you take on this multi-dimensional simultaneous struggle against all of these things at a time now when austerity, the rise of neoliberalism, the rise of right-wing forces of far right and religious right are absolutely dominant? And that, I think, is, sort of fast forwarding to your questions about what are the challenges. These are the challenges for those of us, who hark back to a more progressive politics and want to hang on to that more progressive politics. Now, I've been attacked for calling myself Black by a third generation Black, Black audience that doesn't understand why we use that term Black and what it signified all those years ago. I've been, challenged for challenging fundamentalism and for being called an Islamophobe, and for defending secular traditions which are seen as Western imposed. Human rights, human dignity, these concepts are seen as Western. And it worries me that how we've come to this moment, and what we need to do to both talk to a younger generation, to reclaim some of that history and the history of our struggles and why we did what we did, and to try and galvanize a new audience to around more progressive politics. I think that is the challenge that I certainly feel is the challenge for us today.
Thank you very much, Pragna. It's left me with so many thoughts and questions. I'm just kind of trying to organize also, but I think one of the things that I'm really struck, both Pragna by what you're saying and Suresh what you're saying, is that your activism over the years has been very grounded in a very kind of clear political analysis, a commitment to secularism, for example, and a broader political analysis and an understanding of, how kind of different values to a degree kind of clash, as well as to a degree can kind of support each other. And I kind of wonder whether that's as true today in some of the more recent activism, and whether there are some, what am I trying to say here? Whether there are some kind of lessons. I mean, Pragna, you mentioned about, kind of identity politics of its kind of worst sort, I think I have a sense of some of the things you're talking about there, but maybe the audience here don't. But I'm just kind of wondering, whether how important was it for both of you, for your activism, to have a very kind of clear underlying political analysis, where actually politics is about making choices. It is about, making a decision. Well, what is our position on, Salman Rushdie, for example, on so-called Western values, on human rights? And I wonder whether maybe those choices are, whether that's as clear maybe these days in some of the more recent activism we've seen in this area. I don't know whether Suresh, you might want to kind of kick us off.
I contest the fact that secularism is a Western value. Secularism existed in many parts of the world, especially South Asia, before independence and after independence. And the word secular was reinserted in the constitution in the 1960s in India. So I think it's a decisive issue. And I don't think it was difficult for us in the Southall Monitoring Group to call ourselves secularists when we understood what secularism meant, and as a nature of state which separates religion from state operations and state policies and state legislation. It's not the same form of secularism that the French use and the model that they use, which almost becomes anti-religious, but leaves the Christian dominance in public utilities and spaces, for example, where anybody can't be different but French first and foremost of all, rather than their own religion of choosing, as well as French, for instance. I think the real issue for us was, for the Southern Monitoring Group, was what's happening locally. We weren't a national organization. Southall Black Sisters deserved funding, they got funding, but the Tories began to divide us. They cut our funding, but kept, SBS funding for deliberate political gains and etc. We were in a period of survival, and our focus was really the Punjabi community in Southall, which was, as Pragna's described, becoming more and more religious right because of the Khalistani movement and Operation Blue Star. I mean, there are moments in my life, for example, people refuse to call me by the name Grover or Suresh because they're anglicized and Hindu names. These are people who are close friends of mine. Half of my family, we are refugees really from the partition period, from Pakistan coming into India and then going to Kenya, are I would say blatantly right-wing Hindu supporters. Half of my family in this country is like that. The other half is totally anti and more secular in their approach. So it's very personal, and it's become even more personal because I have, like Pragna would have relatives in India who've been challenged by the current Prime Minister, and, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not difficult issue to think. The issue is, and we didn't, as an anti-racist organization, I'm speaking for the Southern Monitoring Group, unlike other anti-racist organizations, say that if this becomes a problem or a difficult issue, we will lose support in our community. We didn't take that approach. We said we are secularists and we would support anybody who's under threat from fundamentalism, etc., whether it's Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, etc. That's the kind of approach we took, which is much more generalized. And it was incredible for two things. Firstly, we were in a slight contradiction in Southall because the patriarchal groups or the patriarchal organizations that we had fought in the 1970s were actually secular in their approach. Especially the IWAs, they were more secular. They were not fundamentalists. The member of parliament, for example, in Pyara Kabra, who was the IWA leader, was totally secular in his approach. But out and out patriarch, anti-women, anti-gay, etc. So we were trying to negotiate, but we didn't compromise on any of this stuff. The newer community generations, the anti-racists would start fighting on the streets. Sections of them became Khalistan supporters. So it was holding to our principles, being very clear with you. I don't know whether you remember, Pragna, I think the IWA did a leaflet after we picketed their offices when Balwan or somebody was there. They actually did a leaflet that our funding and your funding should be cut.
Yes, I don't
community organization, we're anti-community because you take up domestic violence. We've been through all that stuff. And I think, Richard, to answer your question, if you're not true to your politics and you do not say what your politics are, I've never hidden the fact, even though I've worked in very strong Muslim fundamentalist areas. I've been to areas like, after 7/7 in the London bombings, I went to Beeston, I worked there, people knew that I was anti-racist, people knew I was secularist, people knew I was part of the world, never hid my politics. And you can have a debate with them, and I don't want to be censored. I don't want to have any relationship or alliance with them. I don't want to be censored in areas I go. I don't want to be censored as Southall Monitoring Brick or any as an anti-racist organization to have that debate and defeat them. I remember going to a debate in Hounslow between myself and Hizb ut-Tahrir. And this is after they imposed a death threat on me in Hounslow. And the argument was, should Britain become a Muslim state or not? Obviously, I argued against it. But the audience, there were 500 people, mostly young, 90% voted that Britain should become a Muslim state, you know? So we were in a period of very heightened communal politics. And I think we survived. We survived because of three things. One, there is a legacy in Southall of secular politics going back as 1950s and 70s, especially by people like Vishnu Sharma. And we can't historically, he may not have fought in the way you and I have fought or you have fought, but they had approaches to it as people of the left. The second thing is that by and large, when we were campaigning in schools not to become religiously dominated, the bulk of the parents in the communities are more interested in education than religion. They want their children to be educated in schools where they have proper facilities and key curriculum values, etc. So by and large, the population in Southall is recipient to secular politics. The third is, unfortunately for us, the leaderships in temples, in mosques, in different religious settings are becoming more and more accommodating or taken over by religious right-wing, far-right politics. That's a problem. And there are alliances being made between people like the far right in Britain and far right in Hindu politics, you know, in areas like Southall, where we very, very strong anti-racist history. There's a contradiction, but I think the lessons are that we remain very true and bold with our values. There's no alternative to that.
I think you know, one of the things is that I agree. I think Southall is an area of complete contradictions. There are people there very amenable who have very secular histories and traditions. And there is also the rise of fundamentalism, and that they've captured some of the key, dominating the religious institutions of both Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh backgrounds. And so, but what I think we shouldn't forget the role of the state in all of this, because I think one of the things is that since Rushdie, and we can trace the whole thing back to Rushdie, but our communities have become more and more communalized. They have taken on, you know, regardless of the specific history of Southall, they have been reframed, not as Black or even Asian communities, but as faith communities. And that has come from the top. You know, it has been the government's response to the rise of religious fundamentalism, which is to accommodate religion in the state apparatus. And who is being accommodated? The most regressive forces. They are using the parliamentary spaces, the legal spaces, the education spaces, the community spaces to monopolize resources and to perpetuate an ideology that's profoundly divisive and harmful. You know, and so the redrawing of our communities, which we very much saw as political communities of resistance, you know, into faith communities, is played right into what I think at the moment is the dominance of identity politics. Here we're talking about religious identity politics. And that means that everything in relation to social policy, in relation to state response, is filtered through the lens of religion, you know, and hence the rise of religious schools, the funding of religious schools, the accommodation of more and more religious personal laws in the, you know, parallel legal systems, which is particularly detrimental to women's rights, because women, in particular Muslim women, are being encouraged to use so-called Sharia arbitration tribunals rather than use the formal legal system to assert their rights. The rise of student societies in universities across the UK that are more and more right-wing, religious right-wing. The rise of gender segregation in public spaces. We never saw any of this in the 80s. We never saw any of this, you know. And all of this is detrimental to women's rights, to the rights of other minorities like LGBT groups, and even religious minorities within minorities. We're seeing the real impact of all of this. Suresh, you know, for example, Sikh militiamen, you know, fundamentalists, standing outside gurdwaras preventing interfaith marriages from taking place, or Hindu fundamentalists trying to stop exhibitions by, you know, the artist who's now deceased, M.F. Hussain, because it offended Hindu religious sensibilities, or Sikh fundamentalists preventing the play Besti from being shown at Birmingham Repertory some years ago because it was about rape in a gurdwara, and they succeeded in preventing the play from taking place on the basis that it offended Sikh sensibilities. So fundamentalism has come to define ethnic identities as religious identities, and that kind of identity politics is working against the very things that we have stood up for, which is unity across difference. Which is about drawing on more progressive kind of politics, you know, challenging social injustice, bridging various movements for injustice, bringing together and unifying, and solidarity being a key, you know, part of our work, building solidarity across difference. And so I think that we are in a phase, a political phase, where sometimes I can't distinguish between right and left, because identity politics has taken hold, and it's quite poisonous, and it's quite censorious, and it silences debate, it silences dissent, and which are in a way the hallmarks of what democratic values should be all about. And we see it played out in other arenas, you know, for example, around the whole trans rights debate and so on. I actually think, I actually want to go back to something that Martin Luther King said, you know, even at the height of the civil rights movement, when he said that the end game wasn't challenging racism, but was actually social justice. His next set of program was around fighting poverty and class deprivation. So, you know, we seem to have turned inwards and using identity politics which is fragmenting our struggles and actually poisoning them, because they're divisive, they are silencing of critical debate and questioning and dissent, and they are, you know, dogmatic in themselves. And I think this is, you know, part of the problem that we find ourselves. Do we blame ourselves? Maybe we're partly to blame for what's happened. Maybe we're not. That's another, you know, that is a major discussion. But I think that, you know, the left has also got into this kind of cul-de-sac of identity politics. And more recently, you know, for example, I'm horrified that on the back of Black Lives Matter, there is a whole industry that's kind of built up around training around unconscious bias. I mean, I remember that this was something in the 80s that was challenged because it was kind of feeding into identity politics rather than challenging structural discrimination. And that's the problem, is identity politics ultimately is not about challenging structural discrimination or about dismantling whether it was patriarchy or racism or class inequalities.
Yeah, I mean, there's no dispute about that, but I don't want to finish the meeting with letting the state off the hook, as you have. You know, I think, and I believe that identity politics is retrogressive in many forms and has shifted us inwards and backwards. But we need to have a proper discussion and debate, and we should have that debate more openly and in more public space without any kind of fear. But Richard, I just want to come back to some of the work we've done, and I think Pragna should be given the chance as well. I mean, I think the setting today, apart from the growth of identity politics, which we need to discuss, is also the manner in which the state has really exposed its fault lines by widespread and arbitrary control on streets against Black young people. Even during the lockdown period, for example, we've seen, despite and we don't even have to justify it in the basis, despite the decrease in so-called crimes when people are left in their houses, there's been a massive 80% rise in stop and searches and stop and handcuffs in the capital. We've seen the glaring COVID implications and institutional failures, including not just of the government, actually. There should be a public inquiry, and we will get a public inquiry. But I think with all the data that exists, there should be a public inquiry on how Public Health England also let down BME staff with their lack of rigorous application of their own race standards, which were developed to ensure that BME staff, especially poor working staff, were treated fairly, especially in mitigating circumstances. I know we are going out of time, and we don't have time. I don't have time to do that. But all the statistics show the disproportionality of people who are critically ill from BME communities, people who die, are frontline workers. And it's not just to do with poverty. I mean, even consultants and surgeons have died who are BME. And that's to do with the internal policies and existence of racially discriminatory practices within the health staff at the staff. And I think one last thing I want to say, which is I think very critical and important, is the manner in which the state apparatus, from government to the Equality and Human Rights Commission to the Met Commissioner, have totally ignored all the recommendations of different public inquiries that have come up, refused to and will not recognize structural or institutional racism, and in fact has done everything in its power, especially the government, to politicize watchdogs that have been set up to monitor their standard by employing and creating politicizing them. You have the Met Commissioner, who is the most unpopular Met Commissioner on issues to do where the inquiries have found it to be institutional racist, institutionally corrupt, and from all the issues to do with sexism and misogyny, institutionally sexist, but she's defended and she remains in her place. And I think that is the context that I want to develop. And I went to a lot of BLM marches, Pragna, during the COVID stuff. I actually attended 99%, not just in London, but also in Wales, because we have clients in Wales. And I think while it's a movement which has brought the focus on structural racism, I am not sure, and it has organized a large number of young people, not sure about some of its,
I agree.
Whether it will last, whether it has the same formidable standing as in the United States, especially in working class areas. And I think it's too early to judge whether they will make the impact that they think they can make the impact. And I think there are invariably different conditions in America and in this country, and a different history. And in this country, if you ignore the contribution to the anti-racist movement of Black and Asian and migrant struggles, you are not going to win any form of battles on equality. And we should be uniting rather culturally dividing ourselves. I'll end up there. I mean, I know what I want to say in terms of positive stuff, but I think we are nearing time. I'm really sorry. I don't want to.
Well, no, I mean, I could listen to both of you all day, and I suspect our audience could as well. But we are very quickly running out of time. We did start slightly late, so let's give it for a couple more minutes. But Pragna, did you want to just pick up on
Yes.
on those last points
Yeah.
by Suresh in particular?
I totally agree. I totally agree with, and I haven't talked to Suresh, so I don't know what his reservations are or concerns are about the Black Lives Matter movement. But if I think they are what I think they are, then I agree. I think there's some very good things that have come out of it, but I worry about whether it also is going down the road of identity politics of its own kind. I want to end on a positive note too. There are lots of challenges that we've talked about, but I do want to say that some of the most seminal moments in anti-racist and Black feminist struggles in the UK have been achieved as a result of political struggle. You know, that's the first point. And they have come out of a kind of progressive secular politics, whether it's the Stephen Lawrence campaign that was waged that led to the recognition of institutional racism for the first time, or whether it's the Kiranjit Ahluwalia campaign, which I haven't had time to discuss, which looked at the role of the criminal justice system in protecting women and in recognizing women subject to domestic abuse who kill their violent husbands as a result of that abuse. The Kiranjit Ahluwalia campaign led by Southall Black Sisters actually ended up not only successfully releasing a woman who'd been killed for the murder of her abusive husband, but went on to change the law of provocation and the way in which the criminal justice system responds to issues of domestic abuse. These are really important milestones, and there are many, many more. But they are they have come out of political struggle first and foremost, and that they come out of the need to both meet, provide services to meet the material realities, to reflect the material realities of the people who come to us. And from that, you know, sort of forging a wider politics and a political analysis that understands the kind of structural barriers that some of the most vulnerable groups in our society face. And I do want to end by saying that, you know, we can only achieve this ultimately through dialogue, through discussion, through understanding that what unites us is more than what divides us, and that we really need to come together urgently to find ways of rising to some of these challenges that we have outlined. But I more and more, I'm coming to the view that we need to come together not on the basis of identity, but on the basis of need. And I think those are some of the key things for me at a time when the surveillance and monitoring culture of the state has increased. We've seen it in our work with migrant women who are unable to report domestic violence to the police for fear of data sharing between the police and immigration enforcement. We've seen the ways in which the hostile immigration environment has cut through community, civic spirit, civic cultures, and turned neighbors into, you know, spies. We've seen the way in which the hostile environment policies have drawn in religious and even welfare institutions into that surveillance culture. And these, you know, are really, really vital challenges that we face. We can only face them through the kind of struggles that we have waged over the years. And we've had our differences. Suresh and I have had differences, but ultimately we are cut from the same cloth, I like to think. And the need to reclaim those histories, to talk about those histories of struggle, and to try and pass them on to new generations is vital. They can build on them. They can even tell us that we were mad at times or that we were wrong at times. But what they shouldn't do is throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Thank you very much. We're out of time, and which I'm very sorry about, because I just think this is such an important conversation. Perhaps we should think about ways that we can continue it at a future occasion. And of course, I know that both Pragna and Suresh, you're doing some extraordinary work, you know, in your own organisations and in your communities and more widely. And to individuals and organisations I have a huge amount of respect and admiration for. So thank you so much for giving so generous of your time today. And I think, looking at the audience, we've had a relatively small audience, but we've kept them right from the beginning to the end, actually. And I think that does say something. Now, the next of our lunch with in November is going to be with someone else from another organisation with a huge amount of respect and time for him, Katuna Sinsadze from the Zahid Mubarak Trust. The death of Zahid Mubarak, the murder of Zahid Mubarak, key moment in the criminal justice history, as it were, of recent times. And I'm really looking forward to that discussion. That's on the 17th of November. And then before that, on the 3rd of November, we have the next in our last month in criminal justice events, where we'll be reviewing justice developments during the course of October, during the course of this month. So thank you, Pragna, and thank you, Suresh, for giving us so much to think about. And I look forward to further conversations with you and to our next events. And thank you, the audience, for your attention. Thank you.